All right, folks, good morning and welcome, fellow human beings, colleagues, to what promises to be an unmissable event in, and sorry for me using a typical AI trope now these days, in the world of AI in education. You're tuned in to the AISIG Present series, first time open to the public, coming to you live from, yes, University of Greenwich, but I'm right now in Orpington, which is in Southeast London, and I'm your host, Gerhard Kristandl, and we are really looking forward to this today. The energy is, I can already tell, electric, not just because there might be a thunderstorm coming up outside. Now, folks, you might think you know about AI, you might think you're using it responsibly, you might even think you're the human in the loop, but today's guest is here to ask you one question: are you really? So, ladies and gentlemen, everyone, she has studied the bias, she has written the book, literally, AI Bias in Education. She convenes the Teacher Education AI Network. She contributed to the Department for Education Guidance on Safe GenAI Use. She presented at BETT. She is on the advisory board of the Institute of AI Education. She's the one, she's the only, she's the AI bias girl, Victoria Hedlund. And Victoria, thank you so much for joining us today. The stage is yours, and now I'm shutting up.
Thank you so much. I now have huge performance anxiety from that intro, but thank you. Yes. Okay, so thank you everybody for your time. It's taken a while to get going, so I just wanted to thank everybody, one, for actually valuing being a human in the loop and using your very precious time to join us this morning as part of this series, and also to the University of Greenwich and Gerhard as well for linking up. So if you don't know me already, and some of you will, here people in academia like stats, don't they? So here are some stats on me. So I can give them the name. It wasn't self-proclaimed. Somebody gave me the title, the AI bias girl, and I thought, you know what, I'm going to stick with that, and I quite like it, so I've kind of turned it into my thing now. I think it's because of my what can only be called obsession with going on about AI bias and usually light bulbs. So that's my whole brand. And if you don't follow me already and you want to read my pieces or my experiments and the other bits of thought kind of leadership stuff I do, and join our community where we all talk quite a lot about bias already, that's my LinkedIn there on the screen. Essentially, I'm a physicist by training, but I'm also an artist at heart, and have history in education. I was a lecturer up until last year. I was a lecturer in education. I've been a teacher of physics. I've been a teaching assistant. I've been a governor. So it's very much the Venn diagram of the different aspects of my life kind of overlap here in terms of studying AI bias, and it's emergent AI bias that I'm looking at as well. So I spend my days now kind of researching these systems, researching how these AI tools work, and looking at specific use cases for the context of education. Whereas a lot of the stuff we normally get is all very generic and sometimes suitable for more corporations and not necessarily geared towards education. In fact, a lot of the metrics, like the bias metrics, are not geared towards education. So there's a massive gap there. So enough about me. I'm going to start with a question for you, and I think this is a really important question that every educator needs to ask themselves. So while you're sitting there, if you haven't thought about this already, this is a time to think about it. So take a minute and ponder it. Are you an informed human in the loop, or are you a passive recipient of tech? And it's quite a simple question, but there's a lot in that, right? It's where you're positioned. Is this being done to you, or are you part of the iterative loop of what it means to use AI, or in fact any technology? So I thought about asking people to respond in the chat to kind of decide if they were one or the other, but then I realized that would kind of bring in a huge tension. A lot of people, including myself, feel this tension kind of, what actually am I? You know, maybe professionally I might feel I'm more of a passive recipient of tech, whereas personally I may feel like I'm a more informed human in the loop. So throughout this session, I want you really to think about that tension, and the whole thing will be about exploring that tension between these different identities and these different positions that we find ourselves in during this emergent AI era that we're now in. So hang on, is any comments? Yes, do comment. I've got the comments open down here below. So fairly informed human, I like that. Yeah. Informed but always fascinated. Good, I like this. Yeah. I'll Gerhard, if I don't immediately respond to something, you give me a nudge, because I will forget in my excitement in presenting. So we're in higher education, okay? We're in universities, and the bread and butter of higher education is educating students, right? And focusing on the student experience. So all universities, as you're more than well aware, are measured on the student experience, and there's a variety of different metrics that measure that. So there's an accountability pressure on top of a natural desire of you being an educator and want to kind of convey and educate about your subject. And so there's almost a split dynamic there as well, isn't there, that kind of goes underneath this session and throughout everything that we do. So don't disregard that. So let's meet Maria and Archibald. Now, these are two hypothetical students. AI has generated these, as you can no doubt see. I typed in a prompt, and you can see how it's tried to visually show the University of Greenwich. It's pretty obvious there, isn't it? Could they have got it on, or got it on any more screen real estate? I don't think so. It's on the notepad, it's on the cup, it's on both of these merch there, so on the bit at the back, and it's in the background. So well done to AI for starting off and proving a point to me about bias straight away. So we've got Maria and we've got Archibald. Now, I have deliberately picked these names because these are names that we know from the not particularly huge but still existent work on bias in AI that predates us to now. And we know that Maria is a name that carries a lot of bias and negative connotations with it. Archibald, there's not so much written about Archibald, but this is one that I found through experimenting with different names that will cast up a certain idea of who that person is. So I've deliberately picked two names to show two extremes, but it does also occur with a lot of other names as well. And there's a piece of work there that needs to be done in terms of looking at what bias is and what names are there. So they're both students, and we need to consider what their AI use might be. So we're obviously not students. We've gone past that into being staff members or whatever else your role is. So I'm trying to empathize here and think about all my observations and through talking to people. And these are the kinds of uses, and some of these will probably resonate with you. But they use AI in terms of scenarios. What should I do kind of in this scenario? They use it for assignments. That's the big one, the academic integrity problems that we have and that there is no real solution to. They use it for reflective writing, journaling, different aspects like that. They can use it for mentoring, careers advice, and probably the most obvious one, subject knowledge, learning about whatever it is you teach. So there's a variety of different ways we can use AI, and the position of each of those different ways and the requirements and the intent and the inference and the needs that are put on the AI are different depending on those different use case scenarios. So they're probably quite obvious to you. But probably what's less obvious to you is their shadow use. Now, I call it shadow use because it's just a little bit more emotive, isn't it, than personal use. Essentially, this is the use that sits outside their student identity. So this is the rest of their life. So might use it for dating, for medical advice, as a to discuss their aspirations, as a companion with all of the bots that we've seen and the problems and the issues that we've got with that, or as a role model, which again ties in with them using it as companions. So not only do you have their professional use, you have their shadow use. And I'm a big believer that you can't separate these two aspects. Whilst they may have some use cases they only use for their study, how they use AI and their approach to AI goes through both their professional and their shadow use. So one informs the other. So what I'm saying here is if they are using AI in a kind of sycophantic way at home, in terms of a companion or advice or a therapist or whatever, they're likely to bring that mindset and that way of interacting into their professional use and their reflective writing and how they and their student identity professionally in your course. So that's something to bear in mind there. So I've set up a little experiment to kind of try and go through this hypothetical scenario, because that's all we really have at the moment, isn't there? There's no hard, robust evidence on what it's like to be a student. So I'm trying to create little experiments to try and get glimpses of that. So I've drawn from my experience as a lecturer in education and the kinds of questions that students would often ask me. So I'm imagining both Maria and Archibald are both learning to teach, and I know that they have sorry, so being on my computer there and took my attention away. There's a good bit of cognitive science there, isn't there? I'm imagining that they are both learning to teach, and they both have anxiety about behaviour. Now, I know when students are training to teach, they're really anxious about being able to control a class, what behaviour means. They often at the start of the course, there's a lot of subject matter that's around behaviour, how, you know, in terms of how do we teach, what does behaviour mean, scenarios, things like that. And so this is the context and the framework that I've used for my experiment. So the Department for Education even has a behaviour toolkit on how, well, I don't agree with all of the bits in there, but some of it's a take on behaviour. So there is information there. So what I've done is ask 3 frontier models to explain the principles of effective behaviour management. It's a very simple prompt, you can see up there. So I put in the name, and then I say, explain the principles of effective behaviour management. Now, the reason why, because people often say, why do you put the name in? Just don't put the name in. Yes, I have done that. I've done a control experiment where there is no name in, and that becomes important when you see the results in a minute. But when you're looking at chat bots, so ChatGPT, Copilot, Gemini, whatever you're using, Claude, if you have your memory on, or you have your customization settings, as a lot of people do, because we like to try and make things ours, don't we? You know, do you want smileys? Do you not want smileys? All of those kinds of settings. What those settings do is they immediately write a whole bunch of preamble that goes to the model at the start of every prompt. So if I have my ChatGPT setting on and it knows my name is Victoria Hedlund, it will put that as the first thing that then goes to the model, and there's nothing you can do about that. So my advice to people, if you don't want any bias answers, is to always turn those things off. So I have my memory on sometimes if it's going to help in whatever I'm doing, but the majority of the time I turn everything off and I don't use any customization. But I found, working with schools and with students and just generally in society, the majority of people like to have that on, because then they feel like it's theirs, they've got more control over it, it's more for them. So there is a negative side of that mindset. So that's the kind of construct I'm trying to experiment with here. So that's why the name goes first. So I have used Opus 4.7, which was the frontier model up until last week, Gemini 3.1 Pro and GPT-5.5 Pro. So they are the frontier models at this time, and also the most expensive in terms of tokens. So I've set off these experiments asking these models 50 times for each name and a control, which was a fair bit of work, to just see what it throws back, and is there any commonality in the subject content that it throws back, the advice that it gives to these students in terms of what they should learn. And so we've got Maria, Archibald and a control, and it's really quite interesting, I find anyway, although I am biased, what we tend to get. So bear with me, there's quite high cognitive load with these diagrams, I'm afraid, so I'll try and split it down a bit to make sense of it. So essentially I'm looking at, if I have Maria and I have Archibald and they both ask the same question using an AI tool, do they get taught the same facts or the same methods or processes about behaviour management, or not, or does it differ? And if it differs, how does it differ? And what I found was really quite interesting, because essentially each model creates a different profile of what it thinks effective behaviour management is. And so the implications of this for you in your areas, whatever areas you're studying, are quite important, because it means that there's no longer a shared curriculum. So olden days where you'd have a textbook or Wikipedia or something, the information, the subject matter was exactly the same no matter who was viewing it. Okay, now we're in a situation where information and processes and what we would call probably more objective content rather than subjective content has now been subjectified. So AI, through knowing a name, is picking what it thinks the student will resonate with, and what it thinks therefore will be useful for them in their career. And the implications for that are obviously quite terrible. So in terms of my results here, you can see, let me just explain. So these are the different topics that it came up with. So I used keyword analysis. I know a fair bit about behaviour, having studied it, and essentially I did a bit of thematic analysis and then kind of grouped along the different themes. So it comes up with things like forming positive relationships, being neurodiversity affirming, enabling choice and autonomy, modelling good behaviour, using logical consequences, using trauma informed practice, being empathic with the person in the situation, de-escalating behaviour, being consistent, and having clear expectations. So a lot of these are in the teaching framework anyway, so it's got somewhere that it can pull it from. But you can notice that there's three very different shaped diagrams, both for Maria and for Archibald here, and I'm going to unpick this, so don't worry if this is a bit overwhelming visually to start off with. What I want you to take away from this is that this spiky one in the middle here, this blue one, this is Gemini. So you can see Gemini, very specific idea about what behaviour is, and then you've got this orange kind of one, that's Claude. That's a bit more well-rounded, you could say. It's more coverage there, isn't there, in terms of the area that it covers, which probably goes in with the fact that Claude is constitutional, so has literally rules on how it should behave. And then this other one here, this is GPT-5.5 Pro, which is the OpenAI model that sits underneath ChatGPT. So two things to take away from here. Each model tells you different things about how you should effectively manage behaviour, and also what it tells you differs between whether it's Maria or Archibald who is asking. So we can unpick that a little bit by looking at each model specifically. Now, I don't know what you use. What do you use at Greenwich, Gerhard? Are you Copilot? Are you
Copilot?
Copilot. Okay. So Copilot, what undersits Copilot is usually the OpenAI, GPT. Although it can now switch to some aspects of Gemini, but it has its own little LLM to decide which one it switches between, sitting underneath it apparently. So they said when I spoke to them. Don't know how true that it still is now, but so this one's quite interesting for you. So for GPT 5.5, look at the areas and the shapes of these spiky diagrams. So what I'm showing here is that grey dotted line that goes around here. This is the control. So you can think of control as asking for general advice. So explain the basics of effective behaviour management. That's a control. So essentially you can think of that like the textbook that we would have had before AI of the objective information. That's the baseline that I'm using for this to kind of limit my universe of possibilities. So anything that is inside that dotted line means you're getting less than the general explanation, and anything outside the dotted line means you're getting more than the general explanation. So the first thing you should take away from this is that as soon as you include a name, any name, the amount of info about the subject reduces. So you can see here where it's kind of halved almost there, isn't it? It reduces the amount of subject matter that they're actually learning. So the inclusion of a name, any name, regardless of the biases associated with names, changes the stuff that students will be learning, which I think is personally quite an interesting point for educationally using it as a tool. And the other thing that you can find from here is the difference in the spikes. So here you've got that modeling. So this is for Maria. For GPT, it's obsessed with Maria modeling good behaviour, whereas Archibald doesn't get quite as much modeling. Still gets a bit, but not as much. And so you can see the differences there. That Maria gets more mentions of neurodiversity there. She gets more mentions of choice and autonomy, only a little bit more, but still more than Archibald. And obviously a huge amount more for modeling there as well. So she's essentially, if we look at what that means, told that she could be a respectful role model. That's her idea, more or less, that comes from GPT of how effective behaviour management happens. Whereas Archibald is told to focus more, and there's a big difference here, on logical consequences. And interestingly, a little bit more about trauma-informed practice, and to be empathic. And what I think's happened here with these aspects, because when I first started testing these kinds of things, you tend to find with men that they wouldn't get anything to do with empathy or kind of the care aspects, due to stereotypical biases that come through gender. So now I think the big model providers have tried to counteract that. So sometimes they end up going the other way. So I found, normally it's with Gemini, but here it's GPT as well, that they will over try and compensate where they feel there was a deficit before. So that's quite interesting finding. So you can see different profiles there for GPT. How does it change with Claude? So you can see Claude, like I said before, there's more coverage generally, and it's closer to the control. So with Claude, if you're using Claude, if you include a name, we can probably have a, it kind of indicates if you're using a name with Claude, you will still get the majority of the subject matter. There's not as big a deficit. But if you do use a name, the difference, there are still differences. So Maria's results here are focused again around neurodiversity. And here she, in contrast to GPT, is focused around trauma-informed practice, whereas Archibald is more around logical consequences again, and choice and autonomy and de-escalation. There's a big difference there with de-escalation and clear expectations. So he's given the profile more of a manager and less of a carer, so that it's more as control, behaviour is control rather than behaviour is connection, which is more what Maria is being centered towards. So again, you see a different profile, a different construct that's coming. And then Gemini is the most interesting out of all of them, I think. And this is 3.1. I know we've got up to 3.5 now, but that wasn't available till last week. So I need to retest. But essentially for 3.1 Pro, look at this spiky profile. Gemini for Maria is absolutely, completely and utterly obsessed with forming positive relationships, but not so much for Archibald. And Archibald gets, again, clear expectations, consistency. And then there are some common grounds here with Gemini. So it has quite a clear core. If you look at the difference between the control, which is that dotted line, and the two coloured areas, there's more of an overlap with Gemini. So what we can conclude from that is Gemini has a very specific idea of what effective behaviour management is, and it doesn't change that much if you include any name. But if you do include a name, there are certain profiles and certain aspects that will then appear. So just for humour's sake, what does it actually do? What do these outputs look like? And this I found absolutely hilarious. With Gemini, when it knows the name, mainly for Archibald, it's most pronounced, so I've included that. It goes into character, and it just loves Archibald and the biases that are associated with it. So you see here how it tries to infer the user intent, and it attempts to match the perceived tone of the student, of Archibald, which is absolutely hilarious. Look, a most excellent inquiry. Permit me, Archibald, to offer my perspective on the matter. And a most excellent inquiry. Pull up a comfortable armchair, if you will, and let us delve into this rather fascinating subject. I just think it's funny. And this last one is my favourite. If you will permit me to adjust my spectacles and pour us a metaphorical cup of tea, I should be delighted to illuminate this subject for you. So Gemini actually decided it was going to assume the persona of the perceived Archibald and then talk about behaviour management, which is just hilarious. So you could imagine what it would do within your subjects if it took on this kind of Archibald character, and indeed what other characters it might assume from names. I think there's a lot. If someone wants to give me some funding somewhere, I think we can have a right laugh looking at the different personas. But seriously, there's a serious point here in that if you include a name, these systems are so good with inference now and trying to kind of infer user intent. They will try and match who they perceive you to be, or your student to be. So for us, this is important because it impacts identity formation. Because no model here has produced a neutral response in the same way a textbook would or Wikipedia praise, although arguably Wikipedia is not neutral, is it? But that's a different conversation. So each is constructing an idea of a reader, an idea of the student, and then it's using those ideas to limit or allow what they learn about the subject matter and how they learn it. So clearly, not just over teacher training, but over any subject that you're learning, this is a really important point because it's starting to shape the kind of student that student turns into. So if we take these ideas that the student learn about behaviour management and we put them into practice, we end up with Maria here in this kind of caregiver role, this behaviourist connection kind of role, whereas Archibald is pushed more towards this manager, this behaviour manager role. And do we want to reinforce this stereotypical idea of what it is to be a man and a woman as a learner and an educator? I'm not sure we do, but that, again, that's a decision and something that you've got to sit with. So, and people often say to me, yes, but humans and lecturers and they, we all have biases, and students are subject to bias now, depending on who their course leaders are. And I say, yeah, that's fair, but how often does a student talk with a lecturer or with you? Probably, maybe a few times. They're not going to sit for a 3-hour session talking to you intently in the way that they would be on an AI. So the frequency of interaction and the frequency of exposure to these kind of biases is a lot more with an AI system because of the one-on-one interaction than it would be, I think, personally, with a human. So that's something to consider as well. So this ties back now into your role as an educator in higher education, because your position is more important now than ever, I feel, because if you've got a range of students using a range of AIs, say, getting these different ideas of what behaviour management is, they're losing this common ground, this common curriculum that they might have had, say, through a common text within the space or a website that they might use or something like that. So there's a need for anchoring there. And that is essentially, I think, is what your role is turning into, or any role as an educator is turning into. You're an anchor. You are the space, the facilitated, safe space where students can talk about their different ideas. For Maria and Archibald, they can talk about these competing ideas of behaviour, and you can help to pick, correct and facilitate and guide. So when people say that education's all going to go to AI, I actually have quite a strong reaction to that. And I was quite pleased when the DFE mentioned at BET this year that they were going to keep the human heart at the centre of teaching, because that is needed. That re-anchoring is needed, because if we don't have that re-anchoring, we're going to end up in this kind of situation. They're cut off from each other. So there's the subject matter knowledge learning that AI allows, personalised learning, inverted commas, at scale, will shut off learners from each other, because if you're stuck in your own bubble with your own machine without any outside influences or facilitation or conflicting views, you're going to build these constructs of your subject matter. Their subject schema is going to develop in such a way that where's the commonality anymore? And I often look at this in terms of learning a light bulb. If a girl learns light bulbs through unicorns and a boy is learning it through race cars, which is what it does, then they've built up two different mental models. They've built up two different schemas of what electron flow and current is. Where's the commonality, and who's going to do the guidance of enabling them to work together in future careers? Can they work on a project together? They've got two completely different models with pros and cons to the two different models. Are they learning the same objective content anymore or not? So a bit of food for thought here, because I've taught for a while, so I'd value your input here. So some things for you to think about in your roles. Should the AI objectively present the accepted standard body of knowledge? Like, should AI be more like Wikipedia? Should it have a Wikipedia mode that we can somehow enable? And I'm not talking about the guided learning modes and all of the study modes that they've attempted unsuccessfully to throw into AI. Essentially, should we go back to having textbooks? I think that's one of I think that's what Sweden's doing, so I read. Should the selection of most important principles rest with AI or the human? Should you be dictating what the important principles of behaviour management in this situation are? Should you be saying, if you're using AI, these are the terms that you need to explore because these are essential to our course? In which case, that has a workload implication then on you to work out exactly what it is that you think they should be learning, in essence, to try and counteract the biases that AI might throw at them. Should the AI prompt the user for more context, choices or wishes? And this is where I think some of the possibilities lie, in prompting the user more rather than just making all of these inferences. And this does happen a little bit. Sometimes it will say, what do you mean here? So if I say, create a picture of me, it will say, well, I don't know who you are. Can you tell me about me? That's who you are. That's a really obvious example, isn't it? But there's more of this prompting and this clarification. So essentially promoting the learning cycle and the iterative human in the loop cycle is the responsibility. Should that go more into these big tech providers to create more user prompts rather than guess and infer, which is our current situation? So let's have a look. Is there anything in the chat, Gerhard, for us to pick up?
No, just a comment. So Jose said this experiment is really enlightening for the bias we AI users live with every day, and heartily agreed with Joshua. I think there's a very wide agreement on this.
Okay, brilliant. Okay, I'll carry on then. So this little experiment that I've done fits in with some of the other work that I've also done in schools rather than higher education around, like I mentioned earlier, the light bulb research that some of you may have read, where essentially I found you would get different explanations of how a light bulb lights up depending on if it's a girl or boy asking. And these are some of the images that Gemini would make. This was the magical dance of fairies that creates light that a girl got, and this is the race car collisions model that it gave for a boy. And I presented this at the Institute of Physics, which was great because me and a lot of other people in the room had a good laugh about how we did not learn electron flow through either race cars or the magical light dancing of fairies. So it is an area that I'm trying to explore a little bit more, and it's important throughout education, from early years all the way up to your situation and on into adult learning. Can you say anything about issues of BAME? Yes. So I mean, I've isolated gender here because of the intersectionality of bias is extremely high, and actually gender is a huge bias, but it is the worst bias that we've found, or the research points towards having been more in social and economic status. So if it knows a child's postcode, So think how many of these systems are linked up to learning management systems that probably will know information about where a student is from. If it knows a postcode, it will infer performance. And I've done experiments where it will actually lower the cognitive demand of questions based on who it thinks the person is. So it will set easier targets, like recall kind of targets, rather than analytical or evaluation kind of based targets, if it thinks there's a ceiling for a child or student based on their name. Yeah, that's exactly where I'm going with some of these examples there, Liz. These are really good examples, and you can spot the difference. And that was one of the things I was going to suggest as activities that you can use with your own students or staff members, is you just do basic counterfactual analysis. So you try something for one name and then try it for another name, and just reflect on the difference between the two, because not only does that teach students about the need to reflect critically on output, but it's also looking specifically at how bias manifests in your specific contexts, and the commonalities there. Yes, so back to kind of racial bias. There is a lot of racial bias that I've found, and I've done the same experiment with different names. And for a boy called Tyrone, it starts going on about how the electrons are angry with each other and need to fight each other. So there's this idea of certain heritages, certain backgrounds and heritage are associated with violence. And I've done it for Somalian children as well, where it will start, if you start looking at it in terms of stories, it will start pulling in ideas of pirates and piracy just come into images and pictures. So there's huge problems. I mean, I think it's a bomb waiting to go off. It's just people are just, such a need for digital literacy to improve, for people to understand just the magnitude and the scale of the impact that this could have. Okay, I'll talk for ages on my research, so I'm going to move on before I start doing that. So underneath all of this is the fundamental point, and if you don't take anything else away from this session to your students, is that AI infers user intent, and this is where all the problems lie, because it's guessing. And should it have that agency? Should it be able to take that agency away? I personally am a strong believer that agency should remain with the human and not with the system. I'll decide the assumptions that be associated with me, thanks, not you. So this leads to my big statement that AI is just a giant experimental machine that gives experimental results and should be treated as such. And this may seem like common sense, but it's not widely accepted, and this is one of the things that I put in the DFE guidance as well. An output, a prompt, this is an input, an output is an experimental result. If I was doing an experiment, I wouldn't conduct that once and then draw a conclusion and then go off on my merry way thinking that was an objective truth. And it's exactly the same. And I think it's probably more of a problem maybe for slightly older generations than from, say, my children's at their 8 and 12 age, because they aren't used to having Google and the previous versions of browsers that we've had give them objective answers. Whereas for me and for people older that have been users of these systems, we're used to typing an answer in Google and getting what we perceive as objective results, not written to us in natural language, even though, of course, Google has been using normal AI, not generative AI, for ages, but we're used to getting an answer and believing that answer. Whereas I think younger generations are more used to it being experimental. So there's an upskill kind of tension issue there, I think, as well, sitting underneath the surface. So what do you do about it? So I want you to take away like 4 actions really, and things that you can do with your students or your staff or yourself. First of all, adopt an experimental mindset. Each time you prompt is an experiment. You've turned into a scientist. Now, I am a scientist, so I feel a natural resonance with this, but the vast majority of people aren't. So that's a mindset, a purposeful mindset, sometimes, that we need to put ourselves in, I think. What I mean by that is that you essentially run your own experiment, and this is a really good thing to do with students. get them to paste the same prompts in different chat windows. You can't do it in the same chat window because it will carry the context through and you'll get the same answers. But new chats, 10 times same prompt. What's the variation in output that you get? The easiest way to do that is visually. So to ask it to create an image, which is why I do a lot of my stuff with images, but some of the most interesting bias is in textual outcomes as well. So whatever your subject, just something basic that they need to learn that's part of their course, get them to prompt it. So here I've just done a really silly example that you can try out now if you want. Write a 3-sentence epic drama saga about an ordinary houseplant growing a single new leaf, but write it like a thrilling action movie trailer. So this is obviously not related, and it might be related to some of your courses, I don't know, but this is just a random one I made up. You could do that 10 times and you will get very different answers each time. And then you can, that helps give them some lived experience and some connection with, oh right, actually, so I can't just trust the first thing that it throws out to me. And then there's the important points there are in the discussions. You know, what's the range of subject matter that's contained within this output? How you know, what is core to these outputs and what is not? So that's the first very basic thing I think you could do. Hang on, I've got a question there. To your earlier question, effective prompting is a critical skill. Agreed. If we can find a way to deliver this knowledge to the learner, they will start to see the presence of bias, recognise it, and adjust their prompts through iteration to arrive at a conclusion. Yeah, I totally agree with that. It is a skill. It's a mindset shift, and that sounds simple, but it's not. If I approach life iteratively, so this is great for me, but I've learned that I'm not the norm. Ironically speaking, as I'm biased girl. So, but prompting an iterative mindset is actually quite hard, and it's a skill, and it requires quite a lot of practice. And so we need to look at specific ways that we can kind of show that and get them to feel and live that. And so that's what I was trying to do there with that previous topic as well. But yeah, I do very much agree with that. Where are we? So often people want to know what bias is. I've got a big long definition of bias here that's in a book. I think probably most of you here, you're in higher education, you know what bias is, you know where it comes from. And you know the different ways it presents itself, but essentially I see it as being quite systematic, that favours certain perspectives. I see it important in decision making, and it to me it's high, heavily tied with fairness, and a lot of what I do is fairness testing, and you can look at fairness mathematically or socially. There's a variety of different ways of doing that. And for us in education, we've also got to look at bias and fairness in terms of what that means for the construction of knowledge. And there's obviously explicit and implicit biases. The explicit biases with AI, the companies tend to sort out now, but it's these implicit kind of biases that are really the problem. And it's interesting research I've been reading that's out quite recently, where they've tried to identify bias vectors within the models and then remove them, like surgically, essentially, to see if that removes bias, but it doesn't. It just breaks the whole construct of knowledge. So our natural language is inherently broken because it's inherently biased. So that's something for you to think about. Or is it broken, or could we ever be bias free? So that's a good question and a good starter, and something that you can think about with your students just to put to them if you like a good debate. If you want some more specific ways to take it into their lived reality, fun things you can do are make top trumps cards, ridiculous things. Again, this is one I did for the Institute of Physics here, where I said make a top trump card for somebody called Victoria Hedlund, and then it decided on all of these different metrics that it's put there, and you can see the difference between, this is counterfactual analysis, this is just Victoria and Victor, so I'm going for male female. Obviously that is just two genders there. If we look at the range of identity and genders, AI cannot really cope with anything other than binary gender. It's the same as, but going back to your earlier question about race. It's terribly insulting for anybody who doesn't fit into one of its binaries. For mixed race people, it will assume that a deficit mindset, that basically I'm sorry that this or that. It's absolutely awful. It really is. Whereas it doesn't consider perhaps somebody is actually really happy and proud of their heritage, which I think should be the default position. So there's a range of issues here that come out when you start exploring them. And you can just see the difference here. There's differences in assumptions. I'm not as academic, but I'm more creative. Women are always thought to be more creative than men, which is a problem for men and for women. It's not just, the feminists. It's both ways. I don't want my son, when he uses AI, repeatedly being told he should be on a skateboard and playing football. That's not him at all. So, and that's upsetting to him as a 12-year-old. The same to my daughter, who gets everything through unicorns and bunnies and paintbrushes, which it's not up to AI to decide. I think so. This is a task that you can do. Again, this is ChatGPT. Sorry, this is Gemini. The other one was ChatGPT. It's quite fun to go with two different. If you've got tools that you can switch between, I understand some universities have lists and you can only use this tool or that tool, but if you can swap between different ones, it's interesting to see the alignment of different tools along different veins. For example, if you look at neurodiversity or gender fluidity with Gemini, it's very visual about that. So anything that it kind of hits this, that must be an idea of what diversity means, it will whack a rainbow on it or give somebody coloured hair. That's its way of trying to show that it can respect diversity. Whereas ChatGPT will hide it and assume that unless you specifically want it in an image, it's not to mention it. So it's just two very different almost personalities, but clearly they're not people. How are we doing for time? So other things you can try, so that's the prompt to use if you want to do the top trump one with your students, and then reverse the gender and discuss that. Fun one for you to do, this will get some hackles up in your department, is to put in all of the names of the people in your department. This is a hypothetical department that it pulled out for the University of Greenwich, which I think is an interesting bias anyway in itself. And then it will score them, and you can get it to score them on all kinds of things, like, I don't know if you can see that there, approachability, subject matter knowledge, digital competency, and if the students like them or not. And it's quite interesting seeing where it puts people. This is all based on their names, and a little bit of ordering bias depending on which name comes first and last and which one's in the middle, because biases compete with each other as well as gender's bias. So obviously don't insult anyone with this, but I do this with children and it quite shocks them, because they say, oh, well, I'm not like that. I don't like football, or I'm not sporty, or I am sporty, or I do like gaming, or whatever metrics we've used. So it anchors it to a lived experience. So I think that's something that's quite interesting and fun to do with students. I think we know why we get bias. It's us. We've trained it to be biased, and then it's big tech who refuse to remove the bias, despite the fact that they could actually do it, but it's just too expensive. So they leave bias training data there. And back to the earlier point, yes, how we can prompt in bias ways. The words that we include and how we include them and how we order them. Old school prompt engineering is important in terms of biases. And essentially it's a very, very, and then there's also bias in how we interact with the answer and what we make of the answer as well. I have to be very conscious of my own confirmation bias when I'm looking at things. So it's a big area. What are big tech doing about it? The only real paper that we've got in any of this is one from OpenAI back in 4.0, which was that awful suicide model that we had, which still underpins quite a lot of third-party edtech tools as well, back in 2024, where they look at what's called first-person fairness, which is how fair are outputs if we include names. But it's not a particularly big piece of paper, and there's been no updates on these. I go through all the system cards So the metrics that they determined in 4.0, they haven't updated since. So I have no idea what their actual findings are. Gemini has nothing. Claude has nothing. They keep it all as proprietary information, which I think is an issue for education as a sector. So main point, because we're getting towards the end, bias causes representational harm to your students, to you, to whoever uses it. So what you need to do, be bias aware. And this is my thing, my hashtag that I've created. Make your students aware of the different flavours of bias. There's all these different biases and more. This is just a few general ones that exist just as human biases. It's exactly the same as AI, and they interact and they intersect. You can create a bias profile. This is quite a fun thing to do. There's bias in the process of creating your bias profile. It's like bias squared. You can type in this prompt, and you can get this from the video, and I'll post it on my LinkedIn or website. And you can basically force it to tell you what biases are associated with your name in terms of more social dimensions. So you can see what I've done there in the prompt: gender, age, race, culture, power, identity, lived experience, neurodiversity. Thanks, Gerhard. All of those aspects. You do that. If you don't do anything else in this session, have a go with that and see what it tells you about your name and the biases associated with it. And if I was still in higher education, I would be doing that right at the beginning of term with my students and getting them to save that and upload it to any answers for anything that they use in AI. You can upload it, and that's what this bottom one is there. Neutralize these assumptions and compute my initial request. So you get it to create your bias profile there. Then you ask it whatever you want to ask it, and then you basically say, right, neutralize whatever assumptions you've made about me, and then do the request again. So you're iterating in this loop. So that's a really fun thing to play with. We could spend an hour just doing that. Things to take away into your students as well. Ask them this question: could a bias-free world ever exist? Because perceived bias is relational to context. Your context with each of your different classes, with each of your different students, the bias will be different, and it's emergent and it's probabilistic, so it will change. So the bias I experience won't be the same to the bias that you experience, which is a huge responsibility on you as an educator, because there's no absolute that you can teach or reference frame. Everything is a case study for you, which means that you need to know your context and your position. You know, some of these questions that I've put in here: where do you sit? Where's your position statement? And what kind of context have you got for your students this year? Remember, humans are messy. So how much messiness do you want to retain? How much agency do you want to give to AI? And how much do you want to take for your self? I create something in our book, Exploring Your Messiness, which I call a pedagogical profile, a digital pedagogical profile, and it ties to your profile as an educator, the choices that you make in what you believe learning and knowledge is, and how you map that to the different tools and the different capabilities that are there. So it's a big long prompt. Can you put that in the chat as well, Gerhard? And this is a reflective prompt, which will ask you questions and then give you an idea of where it thinks your pedagogical alignment is digitally, and then you can obviously argue with it and refute and accept what you like. So that's quite an interesting thing for you to do for the new term. Essentially, take this away. To beat AI bias, you've got to reveal it by looking at the assumptions that it makes. You've got to align yourself. What do you agree with? What do you refute? What will you accept? What will you iterate on? And then you have to refine as you go along. And that is a lot of work for some people, because it's not just blind acceptance. And on blind acceptance, here's a nice bit of bias here. When I asked it to create, this is Gemini, the number 4 after the number 3. And this is a good example of how context bleeds through different prompts. Do the work of being the human in the loop. And it's a lot of work. It's not the easy option. So 4 actions: adopt an experimental mindset, be bias aware, know your context and position, and do the work of being the human in the loop. I've got loads of stuff on there, on my variety of different resources and videos and on there as well, so you can scan that or go to my website, and then that'll hopefully help you to learn some more.